Any real introduction, if you don't know Eleanor, you know her by name, or you know her by the reserved parking place, which makes Eleanor a little bit more of an enigma for some of us. But Eleanor is fascinating, and you're in for a treat this evening. Let me tell you a little bit about her. In 1941, think about that, in 1941, when most young women were marrying right out of high school, Eleanor, who was raised in New York City, she began a long and successful legal career working for some of the top lawyers in New York City, and then here in Santa Barbara. She was one of the three, here in Santa Barbara, she was one of the three founding members of the Santa Barbara Associates, our city's first and most prestigious women's networking group. And they've had a long history of the University Club and with the University Club, which Eleanor will tell you about. In 1983, she became the first female member of the University Club, forever changing the focus and direction. How about that? In addition to being one of our most respected board members and most generous benefactors, Eleanor is a trustee of both the Alice Tui Foundation and the Santa Barbara Historical Museum. And I have to tell you that serving on the board with Eleanor is just a real treat. And what's great about Eleanor is, you know, she's seen it all before. And so we're, as board members, when we're kind of blathering on trying to figure out how to successfully operate this club, Eleanor kind of sits back with, I've seen this all before. And then once we're done with our blather, she says something really wise and brings us back to the fold and gets us back on track. And we're lucky that she's been a member of this club for as long as she has. And along with you, I'm looking forward to some of her pearls of wisdom this evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, Eleanor Van Cott.
If you can't hear me, just wave your hand. Interesting thing about working in the field that I did was you met a lot of different people. And the main lawyer that I worked for in New York was one who influenced the rest of my working life. All I had to do was tell anybody when I was looking for a job that I worked for him, and I was hired. They said, that is, if you work for him, you have to be the best. And he sent me a picture of himself later on in life, and he said, the very best secretary I ever had, but he would test me. He would be dictating a will, and he dictated it, and I would take my shorthand, and I would write on half the page, and on over here I put questions as he was dictating. And then when he get finished, he'd wait. And he said, do you have anything you want to comment on? And I'd say, yes, I think you missed this, and I think you missed that. And he was very tolerant of me. He was really a sweet guy. And I'll tell you the funniest story. He had one attorney working with him, and other than that, he was usually by himself. But at that point, he had one attorney working with him, and he said, now, vacation time, he said, I get first choice. He said, you get second choice. The attorney gets third choice. And he said to me one year, I know you're not making any plans for a vacation, he said, so it's probably you don't have enough money, so plan something and take an extra week's pay. So, yeah, and so what it was my husband and I wanted to get married, but we weren't going to get married unless we could find an apartment. And this was 1950, and there wasn't much built during the war, and so apartments were hard to find. And he said, I'm not going to sleep in somebody's basement. So that weekend we did find an apartment, and I went and I apologized to him, and I said, I should have told you what was going on. But he said, well, in that case, he said, take 2 extra weeks' pay. He was that kind of a man. And as I said, I applied for a legal job in Santa Barbara and San Antonio. And that was all his name meant it, you know, you didn't have to have a resume. I never had a resume from then on. All I got to do was say I had worked for him, and I'd be hired. So he was a very nice man. And the interesting thing about him was he had clients in Montecito. He did estate planning. That was what he's known for nationally. But he's doing estate planning for people who lived in Chicago and here. So a lot of my life was that part of it. My first working job and last working job in New York City. He wrote to me until the day he died. always in longhand. He never dictated a letter and had it sent off by his secretary, always in longhand. And one of his first letters recently was, one of his last letters recently, he was talking about the company that Walter and I had worked with, which was a fiduciary trust company. It's a company like Northern Trust, private banking. And he said, you'd be interested to know that they had moved their offices from One Wall Street to the World Trade Center. And when that was hit, they lost 110 people. You know, timing? It just, anyway, about myself and about the girls. I've always been one who watches how other people perform their jobs. And I would always watch the lawyers, as particularly if they have an insurance question of some kind, they'll call up a buddy. And if they have a question at the bank, they call up the vice president or the president of the bank. Well, the rest of us would go in and ask somebody to help us, and you know. No, this is the thing that started me thinking about the women in those years. Now we're talking about 1983. They didn't have a connection between if you were a CPA, you went to CPA meetings. If you were a banker, you went to banking meetings. Lawyers went to lawyers meetings, and there was no cross section. And so I was watching this, and I kept thinking, the women really need that in town. And so I started off, and I don't know, did anyone see the Independent recently where they wrote a big article on Kenneth Millar, the writer? Yeah. Maggie Millar was also a very good mystery story writer, and both of them have been in the papers recently because they're coming up to being republished and by librarian type of things. And anyway, I'm just diverting myself off on that. So she joined, another woman who was actually a direct descendant of Alexander Hamilton. She lived here in town and owns a lot of properties in Montecito. She joined because she was also running a business at that time. And then McClintock, the dentist, she joined. And we had a couple of attorneys, they joined. And so I'm getting, and when I established it, I said, okay, now you're an attorney. You write what you want to be the members in your field. Would you like paralegals, or would you not like paralegals involved? Or, you know, so, and I did that with every category. So they all determined what kind of people they wanted in their own business to join. And one of them was a woman who owned Hertz Rent-A-Car in Oxnard, Korea, and someplace else. She was on the national board of Hertz. She was the only woman on the board at Hertz. She was the only individual owner of a business there. Everybody else was representing a corporation. And so she kind of, you know, this was really women in fields that were very diverse. And so it got to be very popular. And fortunately, we rented space here. I went to the Santa Barbara Club first, because my husband belonged there. And they said, well, we could accommodate you on the second floor if you build an outdoor staircase. I didn't want any women running through there. And I reminded myself of the time in New York when I had to deliver some papers to the lawyer who was having lunch at the top of the Yale University club there. And I walked in the door and the 5 little men were standing right in front of me. And they said, where are you going? And then I told them I was delivering some papers to the attorney. And he said, go over there. So I went and got the elevator. If you got the elevator, it went from the floor to the restaurant. And when you got on the elevator to go down, it came from that floor all the way to the first floor. They didn't want any women seeing anything in between. The funny things that happen to you in my generation, anyway. So I've had diverse sections of my life. My husband, if you'd like to hear about him, he was a graduate of Brown. And he would be frowning if he saw what Brown is like now. Yeah, you know, last semester all the freshmen were nude. That was the way they reported to school, nude. I mean, talk about a liberal education. Anyway, he loved Brown. And then he went to Fordham Law School. And he was working at Fiduciary Trust Company, and during tax season he would get to the bank at 6 in the morning, and at 6 o'clock at night he would leave to go to the Fordham Law School to go practice, get his degree in the legal field. And so it was kind of but he said he had not been eligible for the military, and he felt he had to do something. He said, so I will make myself go to school and get a law degree. At least I will be using my time that I've gotten as a gift, that I could use it to a great extent for his own purposes, but also to keep himself out of trouble, I think. But he, anyhow, everybody who knew Walter liked him a lot. In my life, he was a jazz fiend. And after he died, he had 2,000 long-playing things, all jazz. I have a very small house. Every closet in the house was all records, all the way through. So I figured, what am I going to do with that? So I gave them to UCSB for their jazz department up there. And they were very happy. They were, oh, look at this, all of that. Well, it was all things that they hadn't seen before, so it was good. But presently, I'm on the Alice Street TUI board because Mrs. TUI in her lifetime said, I told those men that they needed to put you on the board, and they had to amend their articles of incorporation to make it 5 members instead of 4. And she said, I didn't tell them why, but I'll tell you why. She said, I want a woman on the board when I die because those men won't put a woman on the board. And she was from Minnesota, from Duluth, and was an utterly charming woman. My profession, I met so many people. I met Irene Rich. I don't know if you remember Irene. Irene Rich, when I was, during the war, she had a radio broadcast that she was always writing a letter, and the letter would go into a story. That's where the Dear John letters came from. And then she was on Broadway in a play called As the Girls Go. And As the Girls Go, she was the first woman president. And they had, so the next thing I saw, she was on Broadway with that, but she was the first vice president. And then Walter got the job here. And he came home one day and he said, guess who was seated at my desk? And I said, well, I can't guess who was it. He said, Irene Rich. And she lived in Hope Branch. And she owned 3 or 4 different pieces of property, one of them from the Las Palmas Drive all the way to the ocean, you know, there. Yeah, with 2 houses on it, and she just loved real estate. And she bought some real estate up in Palms Desert, up on that. She bought a section of land up on top of one of those mountains there. She was interesting. She did decoupage. Have you ever seen people do decoupage? She decoupaged a piano. Anyway, she said she didn't like it, so she took it all off and started all over again. And then she said, nobody told me you could take the legs off the piano, so I wasn't having to struggle this time to do it. But she was well into her late 70s, and she was driving a truck back and forth from Las Vegas, Palm Springs. But, just people like that influenced my life. Mrs. Toohey influenced my life. To work with some woman like that who had a lot of money, and I don't know if anybody knows the Toohey Foundation in town. She set it up with her estate, and at her death in, 1979, it was about $1 million. It's now about $21 million.
Oh, wow.
And so they make grants every year to certain areas that were her interest. Whatever she was in, arts, scholars, medical, because her second husband was a doctor. So she and her first husband, and he was, during the 20s, he was buying all the artwork that was coming in to the United States from Europe because they were selling their art to have money to buy food. So her husband was buying it and buying it and buying it, and their combined gift to the University of Minnesota was 306 paintings, mostly the Barbizon era. And one of her paintings after her death, one of them was at the Louvre. And she would have been ecstatic to have been able to have that experience. But anyway, so now it's named after her first husband, is the Tweed Museum of Art. And that's where all her collection went. But she was a funny lady, and working in the legal profession always seems to people to be hard, but it's the field you're in. If you're in litigation, I always say the wrong people win, but litigating lawyers in here. I've been offered, they wanted me to work for Ed Schramm when Bud Palmer died. And I said, no, I don't like litigation. I mean, he was the senior partner, and I turned him down. But your job is important, and you want to do a job you enjoy. So I've always done corporate work, and there's a name that's very familiar to most of you. Armand Hammer was one of our clients in New York. One of many lawyers he had, or has. But his grandsons live in Montecito, the Hammer boys. One of them was in the movies. But no, he had an interesting story. When the 1945, an airplane hit the Empire State Building. They didn't have radar in those days. And so it was foggy, and he hit the Empire State Building on the 17th floor, and he was on there. And so everybody rushed up to see it, and did Armand Hammer? No. Armand Hammer, there was very little space to rent in the city because there'd been no building. He called up the Empire State Building and said, those people don't want that space, I'll take it. But I think this is a very interesting, these are stories that are well known, so I can talk about it. He had, what do you call it? I would say a ranch in New Jersey. Everybody thinks of New Jersey as Jersey City or, Newark. But it's very rural in areas. His was very rural, and he was raising black Angus beef there. And when I left New York, I went to San Antonio, Texas. My husband took me to that place. And it's got bad memories for me. When I was down there, they had a business there that was doing research on getting the breed of the black Angus beef improved. So they rented Armand Hammer's mail and flew him down in a private plane for 6 months for $50,000, and then they flew him back in a private plane. And the next year, when they had this big to-do in San Antonio about the ranching and stuff, the offspring of that male won the first prize. So it was worth the $50,000. And all these stories intertwined, you never know what's going to happen on some of them. But Has anybody got any questions for me?
What year was that?
When I was down there?
When the cow.
That was, I went there in 1952 when I stayed there exactly 3 years. When I told my husband, either we leave or I leave. And he got looking for a job, and thank God, I said, it's the only reason I'm in Santa Barbara was because we went to San Antonio and I hated it. I was a damn Yankee from the minute I walked in. And I went from the upper stock of lawyers down to the lowest stock of lawyers. Sorry, but I mean, they were terrible. They were terrible lawyers.
Were you looking at Tom when you say
No,
that?
but he knows me well. It was I can't even tell you what it was like. One of the lawyers could not stand being around the women because he was always grabbing them. And, yeah, I mean, it was just in front of everybody, you know, just, so I'll tell you one funny experience for that. I'm sitting there typing away at something, and all of them were getting, you know, excited about something. I didn't know what it was. I was concentrating on what I was doing. And they came over and they said, aren't you excited? It's just like that, aren't you excited? I said, excited about what? They're putting a TV antenna on top of our tallest building, 23 stories. And I said, they put one on the Empire State Building. I didn't look at that one either. See, I was a damn Yankee. I always had a damn answer for it. But, you know, it was such a change of culture from New York City to an area that was I mean, I can't even tell you some of the stories that I encountered there. It was just, I worked for a lawyer, and his idea was I don't do work for anybody else, even if I don't have anything to do, because I was there to be available when he needed me. I read a book a day almost. It was just, I was bored to death, you know? So you can get jobs like that. I'd rather have a challenging job than one that you just sit and wait for somebody to tell you what to do. And John Maple recently, when I was doing a change in my estate planning, and he said, well, you write it. And he says, just let me look at it. He said, you can do it as well as I can. But I liked estate planning. That was what the man did in New York that I knew and worked for. It was always a plan, and you could, as a person taking the notes, you could actually make a plan for yourself of how the money is going, where it's going, making sure it eventually ends up someplace.
Question.
Yes.
I just wanted you to tell a little more about the Santa Barbara Associates and how they ended up being
Oh, okay.
accepted.
That's what I'm here for, right? Yeah, well, that's right.
And how that group has evolved.
Well,
Thank you.
yeah. Well, you can see,
It's okay.
the Associates was started because of the same thing. I thought that the women in town were not meeting each other. And I did that work very well, and we got, how many, 295 members at one time? And as I said, a lot of them are still there. And it's an amazing group of women when you're in a meeting with them and realize that how many different viewpoints you have, how many different experiences you have, and it's a very nice group of women, and it's testimony to the caliber of the women we have in Santa Barbara who are working, and like Mary is a perfect example of it. Joe Weidman. I mean, these are women who have done successfully. Mary was head of the Red Cross here in town, what, 26 years? Yeah. And so you look around and you think of the young women I see today, and I encourage them in every aspect of their work to get a job that you can contribute to, rather than, yes.
When the associates in 1983 became involved with the club, how many associates became new members of the club? Do you remember?
It was quite a lot. I think it was 245 who joined at that time.
It was a big number.
It was a big number.
Big number.
And over the years, they moved out of town and things like that, but then more women are joining still too. But no, it was a very good move for the women as well. George, I had a last name, I can't remember his last name, I should. But George took me into the main dining room, and he says, I want to make you the first woman to eat lunch here in the dining room. Right after we were accepted. Yeah. But this is a story that's very funny, because I was at one of our festivities here, and was seated with some other people at the table, and the woman leaned over to me. She said, the worst thing they ever did was let women into this club. I'm glad I didn't give her my name, but I sat down and just kept quiet. Yes.
Did you ever want to be an attorney yourself?
Actually, one of my lawyers that I work for suggested that to my husband. I never had college. You can't get into law school without a college degree.
I found that out.
You found that out, yeah. No, I would have liked it. There's several of the lawyers I worked for who thought I should go to law school. You know, as I said, I never had to show my resume once I mentioned my old boss's name, so they never knew I didn't go to college. But I've always been able to immerse myself into the work, and I guess that's truly it. But the man I worked for in New York, he'd come out at 5 o'clock if I were typing. What are you doing working late? Go home. I said, well, I was just writing a personal letter. Oh, I'm so sorry. He was afraid he was, disturbing me. But, no, he was, you had a good lawyer like that. He never discussed his clients. That's another thing. He would give you the name and all the documents that you had to do. He would never discuss anything about their personal lives. And it was kind of interesting, I would see different people coming in as, they were coming in from Chicago, they were coming in from Santa Barbara, and I never knew who they were or anything about it. And I would get documents to do, but as state lawyers in here, you're a state lawyer, okay. The man I worked for in New York, the last time I saw him, he said, you would have been interested in this. He said, one of my clients was in Manhattan, the other one was in California. The one and I don't remember which was man and which was woman, but the one in New York dropped dead. And they telephoned the one in California who dropped dead. By the death certificates, the California one died first. This one died first. They had to go to court.
Lynn has a question for you. Lynn?
Well, we were talking about when they weren't sure if women could afford to join the club, and you had a story about that.
I couldn't hear you.
They were talking about when the men were asking if women could afford to pay the monthly fee.
Oh, well, it wasn't a monthly fee. It was $500 to join. Now, that's a lot of money. And they all put up to $500. And then when they offered us the memberships here, it was at $300. And they needed a new kitchen. I found out later. So I said, okay, for those of you who want to join the University Club, I will give $300 out of the $500 to you to join. And for those who don't want to join, I will bestow $300 to you directly. So that everybody ended up still with the $200 on deposit. And that still is the capital that we built up by investing and stuff, and using the income to run the club. And we don't have any dues, and it's open to any professional woman who's in business with, I don't mean professions, but actually a woman who's working at a job on an executive level. And it's been a wonderful group. You go year by year and you realize how some of them are so important and so much in town. And the woman we had who was an insurance person, she was the only woman who had, I've forgotten what her degree and everything was, but she was the only woman from Oxnard to Ventura that had her credentials as an insurance person. And she was part of the, what's the carpet company in town?
Carpet?
Carpets. It's an old company. Anyway, she was part of that family.
Star?
Star King.
Star?
I can't remember what the name of it is.
Haywards?
Helen
Andros.
Andros. Helen Andros.
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 Helen Andros.
Andros, that's right, Helen Andros,
They did,
yeah.
they did,
Yeah.
right.
Eleanor, what was it like when
Yeah.
the women first came in? I've heard stories that they had to come in the back door, the place was a
Oh,
mess.
yeah, we had to
Tell
come in
us what
that
women
way,
did.
yeah.
Tell us what women did.
There was a lot of,
Let's-
in fact, 5 men quit.
Uh,
And I don't remember whether there were 2 or 3 who came back. They all went over to the Santa Barbara Club and ended up coming back. But not all of them came back, but it was, we had, one of our group came in with, had this beautiful chandelier that she knew someone was selling, and it was gonna cost like $1,200. And we were hanging it, holding it up, thinking what it would look like and what could we have on either side of it. We don't want that in there. It looks too feminine. So we didn't get it. And, it's one of those things that happen. But they would come by and say, oh, grouchy. But later years, they said, many of the older men said, the best thing we ever did was let the women in. This room was all big, heavy wooden chairs with Naugahyde covering. And they were all lined up against the wall. There was nothing there. No, and in the dining room, the main dining room, the walls were covered with coffee stains. I don't know what they had, arguments over coffee or what. So it was kind of a revelation to think, but one of my members, who's still in town here, and she does interior design, and her last one I talked to her about, she was working for some people from Los Angeles, and her budget was $1 million to furnish their house. Yeah, she did the furnishings originally here, and she got everything at cost. All these pictures that you see, she found in the basement of local galleries. They didn't know who they were. Nobody knows who that is or that is or anything. She just found these and brought them in because they were fit the period. So people will say, well, are they? We don't know. But she had that eye for decorating, and so they contributed. I mean, a lot of the women were very anxious. Oh, my story is one day I was a little late getting back from lunch, and Harry said to me, what were you doing? And I said, I was collecting money for new dishes because there's not one dish that matches another in the club. And he said, you'll never raise it. And I said, I already did. And he said, how'd you do that? And I said, well, they used to have 2 round tables out there for the men.
Right.
And I'd walk by and I'd say, we need new dishes, give me some money.